Hey everyone, welcome to the Intelligent Conversations podcast, where we believe everyone has a form of intelligence that resides within them. Our goal is to encourage these type of conversations for our audience to listen to. Without further ado, welcome to the show. Hey everyone, welcome back to the Intelligent Conversations podcast. Today I have the honor to speak with Jeff Lee. Jeff has served multiple positions in public office, specializing in public policy. He has ran multiple 100-mile ultramarathons, which I think is crazy, and been to 85 countries and has attended games at every major league baseball stadium. Jeff is also very involved in his community and is an activist for the anti-Asian hate movement. So Jeff, thank you for coming on. I look forward to listening to what you have to say and learning from you as well. And I think the audience can speak the same as for them as well. But I want to get right into this, ask you a question right off the bat. What kind of got you into public policy? I'm not too sure what that is. I mean, I'm at that age where everyone's making decisions. What's that like? What is it that you guys do?
Well, I'm glad you asked that. And it's so great to be here. I'm so excited about our conversation with our audience today. What is public policy? That is the first thing my Asian mother asked me. She was like, what is this? Right. My parents were both people from Vietnam. They escaped the war. They were in refugee camps in Thailand and the Philippines. They landed in the United States with nothing. And I don't think they imagined that their son would work in public service, broadly speaking. I think they were kind of picturing, hey, how about doctor? How about engineer? How about lawyer? How about small business owner? How about anything that we can explain to our friends in 10 seconds, right? It didn't work out that way. And I got to tell you, actually, when I was 10 years old, all I wanted to do was be an astronaut. That's all I wanted to be, Josh.
That's so cool.
It was so cool. But here's the thing. Being an astronaut's hard. And number two, you got to be pretty darn smart to be an astronaut. And I would say very specifically brilliant. Like you have to have amazing quantitative mathematics, physics scores. And I just could not meet that level of rigor. And what I realized more as the reason why I wanted to be an astronaut was I wanted to explore things. And you highlighted some things that I've done in my past. And that's the theme of my life, is trying to explore what's possible, what's new, and what's achievable in a way that maybe we haven't thought about before. And what I realized was I was less interested in space, but I was more interested in learning about new things about people and places. That's what I was after. So when I was in college, after I realized I'd never be an astronaut, also because I have terrible vision and flat feet, which doesn't help, I, on a late night Denny's run, so going to a late night diner, decided with some friends that I was going to change my major, and went into international relations. And I needed to go study abroad, because if you do international stuff, you need to go overseas. Which was terrifying, because Josh, I'm from Southern California, and where the thing you're most scared of is like when it rains 10 times a year. Heaven forbid snow or sleet or fog or whatever. And I remember I studied in England for a year, and when I got there, I made these friends from about 50 countries around the world. It was incredible. And September was beautiful in northern England. And when October 1 came, it was snowing and windy and awful. And I was like, oh, this is great. I brought my jacket. And my German friends were like, Jeff, that is not a jacket.
That's
because it's out of California. It's a light jumper, right?
Exactly.
And so I remember for the first time getting my first winter fall jacket was overseas. So I had a little bit of naivete, if I had to be honest with you, Josh. And I think when you talk to people who go into public policy, basically that's sort of the goal of trying to advance things to help people. That's what I think of, whether that's in government or in community engagement or being able to connect communities together. That's what that is, right? So it's that opportunity to bring people together to try to move something that's bigger than them. That's what I think of. And like anything, you fall into it, right? Exactly. And that's what happened to me. It has a way of taking over, right? Like once I decided to do international stuff, I found myself thinking, well, what am I gonna do with international stuff? And I was like, well, this whole diplomat thing is pretty cool. So I ended up working at, American embassies overseas, which was cool.
Oh, that's
and
so
you got
cool.
you get to see how the United States does, relationship building around the world, which is neat. I realized more and more that I wanted to be closer to everyday people. And that's why I went more into international development work, like trying to build economic corridors and opportunities. But I had also worked at the United Nations and some other, institutions that you've heard of that are trying to resolve big issues. And I just, the more I resonated to see exploring things, I learned two things the more I explored. One, the farther you go, the more you appreciate home. And I think every time I traveled, I sort of have a new appreciation for America, the greatest country in the history of Earth, right? And then the second thing I realized, Josh, is that the people who have the least always give the most. And that's just something that wherever I went, whether that was in Southeast Asia or Sub-Saharan Africa or in Latin America, the kindest people were the people who had almost nothing to give. And they were the first people to offer everything they could. Yeah. Even though they had very little to provide. And I just try to take that perspective, it's like, gosh, we're privileged, Josh. We live in, the most affluent, wealthy, achieved nation in the history of Earth, right? In all of humanity. And there's so much potential here. And there's so much more we could be doing for others and other communities. And obviously, as a leader in the free world, we have a moral responsibility. And so I think about these things in the work I do, whether that's been in government or in technology now, or even when I do, ultra marathon running, or even in advocating for, against Asian hate, which, I don't know if your audience has seen, but, there's been a significant increase in anti-Asian sentiment and violence, especially during COVID-19. I mean, the FBI has reported it's been the highest year of hate crimes in 12 years. Even in diverse states, you have hate crime against Asians up 100%. It's kind of crazy. I mean, you'll hear stories in New York where Asian women particularly have been beaten up and it's been caught on video. And it's also been recently the 1-year anniversary of an assailant who murdered women of Asian descent in Atlanta. And that really, that was a year ago. So just thinking about how quickly time goes during the pandemic, right? It's hard because the thing is, the truth is, Josh, this stuff's not new. This is actually old news. It's just that people, because of social media and because of the way we communicate, it's so visceral that the New York Times a week ago can report about a man who hits an Asian woman 125 times in the head because she's Asian. It's almost obscene.
Yeah, it's not pleasant to hear stuff like that. And I mean, especially with social media, I think a lot of times we see these horrible things online and next thing you know, like, oh, that's horrible. Like, let's hit that like button. Oh, my thoughts and prayers, whatever. Swipe next one. Right. And I think we're all like, we just move on with our lives. And I think, sure. I think we've all recognized that, yes, there's bad things that happen. Right. And like you said, we live in actually a pretty good place. We live in a place where, yes, bad things happen here. Like, I think we're no stranger to that. If you go across the world, you don't have to fear for your life. Like, there's some countries that are just war-torn countries. And I don't want to I try to remain impartial on this podcast. I don't like to take one side or the other, but especially with the things going on in Ukraine, it's a war, there's war happening there. And for us, it's just, even during World War II, the only time that we were attacked was Pearl Harbor, on our own soil was Pearl Harbor. And then after that, we were usually defending other military islands, or we were going on the offensive. It was never, we've been attacked on our homelands. We've never really experienced hardships, I think, is the real.
I'm glad you highlighted World War II, because it was also during World War II, right, where Japanese Americans were being interned.
Yeah.
Right. They were taken from their businesses and places of commerce and their livelihoods and imprisoned just because they were of Japanese descent. We weren't interning German or Italian Americans during that time. So that was 70 years ago. Wasn't that long ago, if you think about it, right? 1945, not that long ago, especially when you think of the context with the Russian invasion in Ukraine, right? It's kind of surreal to think that you're on the doorsteps of a potential third world war. It's very possible. But also it's a great reminder about why we need to be doing more as a citizenry to understand our role in the world. That the reason why our country is what it is because it's built on the sacrifices and courage of others. And so you and I have a responsibility as Americans to take on that mantle. And that in the event that bad things happen in the world, that the United States is going to have to play an important role, which means it's public, it's people, it's citizens, it's community need to play that active role. And as you've seen, when the United States doesn't play that role, someone else does.
Yep.
So my view is always, would you rather have us do it or someone else? And generally people feel comfortable if it's us, even if it's not perfect, far from.
Yes.
And listen, it's sort of that Spider-Man comment, right? Great power comes great responsibility.
Mm-hmm.
Very much that way. And, I think about, you think about decisions you make in your life, you're in a position of influence. You're able to convene conversations here. Like you have a responsibility to educate, inform, have discussions and dialogue. And as we need more of that, not less.
Exactly. I like that you touch on that. That's something, and thank you one for the kind words there. That was really kind of you to say there. That's something when I started the show was my intention. I was like, I think it's something I've noticed is usually when conflict arises, the best way to solve that problem is just to sit down and have a conversation with someone, even though it's so uncomfortable sometimes. Having that conversation is really just something that we need more as a society. Like taking the time to have that conversation, I think, is one of the most important things that we could do. But ultimately, I want to ask you this. We've come up with a lot of things. The U.S. we're no stranger to racism. We've done that.
Sure.
But I think it's a social issue, I would say. And you having experience in public policy, what would be your, this is a big question, but what would you say is your cure for all? What would you do for that?
Well, yeah. How do you get world peace?
Yeah, exactly. Like what would be?
No, it's first off, it's you're right. It is a big question. I actually look at it as not just a social issue.
Okay.
It is an economic issue. It's a justice issue. It's a public health issue at this point. I would put that in there too. So, our society is all encompassing, right? 325 million people in this country. Mm-hmm. And in the Asian American communities, there are, just for perspective, Josh, there are Asian American communities that have been here since the mid 19th century. Mm-hmm. So you have Asians that have been here longer than German Americans, Polish Americans,
exactly,
Eastern Europeans, Western Europeans, right? But nobody is like, hey, you're not from here.
Yeah.
Right. So I just think about that. Right. Some of these waves of immigration came well after Asian Americans arrived here. So it's sort of this interesting, there's this challenge where you're sort of permanently not from here, the sort of forever foreigner thing.
Yeah.
There are a couple things, right? So first, I think basic understanding of history. So like what we just talked about here, so few people understand or have experienced Asian American history, learn about the history. There's a huge movement right now in the US on Asian American curriculum at the high school level. So the states can pass laws that would require learning about Asian American history. Yeah. Recently, the states of Illinois, New Jersey just passed laws. And now Florida has recently had a conversation. So not exactly the most progressive place in the world.
Exactly.
And there's bipartisan support for that. So I tell people, before you can understand a community, or at least think you can, just learn about the history. The problem is Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, it's 50 nationalities, 100 languages at least. So understanding that it's not one size fits all. Right. So, and also like think about the different waves of history. Right? If you're Chinese American, Japanese American from the 19th century, that's one thing. My parents are Vietnamese Americans from, 1975. Right. It's a very different history and lineage. Mm-hmm. Right. And then there's everything in the middle. And there's recent immigrants who've come here from Afghanistan. Right. After the conflict.
All that.
Right. So, which, by the way, that was not that long ago, where we were talking about more Afghan refugees coming here. Right. And so whenever there is a global conflict, you have to have a conversation about new communities coming here to start a new life, and the sort of the permutation of the American dream, right? And I want to say this before I sort of dive into some of these like key things that everybody can do, and just sort of highlight this really important point that, you know, when my parents came here, they came here for the American dream, right? But the American dream is not their dream. The American dream is the dream that allows their children, so me or other children,
exactly,
to do anything they want to do. But that implies that they don't get to dream. And that's probably true. So my parents came here, they started a gardening company, and then they became chicken farmers in Georgia, right? Third grade education, salt of the earth people. They worked 18-hour days their entire lives. Mm-hmm. And because of that, I get to dream, and I get to have these things, and I get to talk to you right now, right? So just understanding that, like, the immigrant experience, like whether you're Vietnamese American or Chinese American or from Laos or from Botswana or Argentina, there's a lag on the generation, and that whoever comes here first is the one who's going to have to do a ton of hard stuff and not get very much back directly. So that's what I would just say. So first is learn the history. And one thing I would recommend, and I recommend to the audience here, I tell everybody, whether that's organizations, companies, community members, individuals, PBS has a great documentary on Asian American history. It's called Asian Americans. We can put it in the show notes, but it's extensive and long. Two reasons for this. One, very few people have actually watched anything on Asian American history. Two, a lot of Asian Americans have also not learned much about Asian American history. And that's really important. So it is not just like a white people thing, you should learn this. This is
everybody needs to take the time to.
Everyone needs to, because you got to get to a baseline, right? Yeah. Because otherwise, someone that looks like me might always be foreign, right? I mean, just a few weeks ago, somebody asked me if I had chopsticks on me, right? Just like randomly and during the day, like I'm in a suit and tie, and they're asking me, "Hey, do you got chopsticks?" And I'm like, "Actually, no, I don't have any chopsticks. Do you have chopsticks?" You know, I mean, I'm used to that kind of thing. But the other thing I highlight, so one thing is understanding history and about the dream. The second thing is understanding that there's a gender component to it, right? So it's one thing for me to be an Asian American guy. Yeah. I've had not so good things happen. I've been spit on in public spaces, not doing anything. I've had harassment. I've had not so good things happen my way. Asian American women have it way worse than I do. So there's sort of an intersectional component where Asian women have disproportionately had way more degrees of violence against them, harassment, discrimination, probably, you know, and self-reported counts from the advocacy group Stop AAPI Hate, probably in the form of almost 3 to 1.
Yeah.
That's self-reported. So that really means the magic number is much bigger. The magic number is much higher because of cultural reasons, or just like English language proficiency, or just shame, right? Asian Americans are the least likely group to report stuff. So just understanding that Asian women have it way worse, and that there do need to be more sort of deeper policies in place focused on sort of the women component of that. That's important. So understanding that women have it worse, understanding the history, understanding what the dream means to new Americans, that's important. The other thing what you and I are doing now, you and I are talking about to your friend to have a conversation about their experience. Ask them, because actually most Asians have probably never been asked like the family story. It's just it hasn't been done. So like, listen, right? If you want to be a good advocate for the community. So I talked to you about getting spit on. So the beginning of the pandemic, so 2 years ago, I was walking through an airport and I got spit on by a stranger. She told me to go back to where I came from. I don't think she meant California.
Yeah.
And I looked around when that happened, and there were about a dozen people, and all of them pretended it never happened. Not a single person did anything. So there's sort of this bystander issue, right? So one thing I tell everybody is to go through a bystander training, so that if something like that happens, you know what to do. Yeah. Because you know the sort of story, if it happens to me, it's eventually going to happen to you. So it's in your interest to do something, right? But you know, Asian Americans advancing justice has a great training we can put in the show notes. But that's something I sort of tell people, right? Last thing related to this particular discussion on sort of community support. There are a number of organizations right now that are doing a ton in advocating for Asian Americans. Probably the two most notable, I'll just flag here. I mean, Stop AAPI Hate, the big group that is advocating for sort of awareness on these issues. The other is Asian American Foundation, which is sort of the largest philanthropic effort that is working with different civic organizations to educate people. I think that's great. And then what you can do sort of on an everyday level, in terms of commerce, I mean, go support an Asian business or restaurant. Like, it's not hard to do. During this time when businesses shuttered, right? You might remember they all came back eventually, and they were given grants or loans, right? Well, a lot of these Asian businesses had to use their loan money because of vandalism. So their restaurant or whatever was more likely to get vandalized during that time. So then they had to use it to fix it rather than actually support their business. Yeah. So that's a way we can help as well. So those are a few things I'd recommend to the audience listening here, specifically on Asian American Pacific Islander issues, what you can do to support that change and advocate. Because again, this is not issues these are not new issues, right? It goes back since 1850s. So these are not new, and these things don't just go away. I mean, like I said, every day pretty much in national media, you will hear a story and see a video of an Asian woman getting beat up by a stranger.
Again, it's something you don't want to see. It hurts. I think this is something I like to believe in myself. I think that 90% of people, even I'm so far wanting to push it, 99% of people, they're good people, right? They want to try their best. They want to do what they think is right. And I think sometimes we get stuck in that self-righteousness, right? And then we don't realize that we're hurting other people sometimes. And I think that in itself, maybe we need to be a little bit nicer to each other. And maybe, like you said, understand the history and say, a famous Dale, I don't know if you're familiar with Dale Carnegie, something he mentions, he's like, if you were placed in that person's shoes for just, for the duration to that point where you're looking at them saying, well, why are they doing this, or why, or whatever, right? You would almost say, hey, if I was in their position, I probably would be making the same choice as well, right? Sometimes I think we need to take that time to understand the history and say, hey, this is why this person's doing it. And again, you mentioned that at the end, you have to be able to stand up, have that justice, and say, hey, some things, because if we just let things happen to us, eventually there's people out there that will take advantage of you, and you have to stand up for yourself and have justice. So that's something I think a lot of people, and thank you for touching on that. I think a lot of people could use that, but I want to get some of your thoughts on this. What is I mean, you mentioned getting spit on in an airport, which I think that's horrible. There's no reason why anyone should do that to any human being, but I mean, especially with the reasons you gave, that's awful. What was your initial reaction to that? What was that kind of like?
Oh, being spit on?
Yeah.
Well, so I will say this, getting spit on, first off, it's happened to me before. So I've experienced dealing with it. And actually, when something like that happens, I've had so much experience with it, just like many others in my broader community. What I do is I tell a joke, because I find it's the best way to diffuse the issue, because otherwise someone might get killed. So when I got spit on, the first thing I said was, well, gosh, if I knew it was going to rain, I would have brought an umbrella. And it's the only way to kind of get out of that situation. Here's the thing, Josh, what's worse, being spit on or watching a dozen people pretend it didn't happen?
The dozen people probably ought to be, I mean, at least stand up for the guy and say, hey man, that wasn't cool.
Here's the thing. If you brought up a good point about believing in the best of people. If those dozen people were a dozen different people, would it have been the same thing?
Maybe not. It depends, right?
I bet yes. And if it were a dozen people, but one of them were you, would you have done something? And I want to say yes, but I don't know. And that's why we need to have these conversations.
Exactly.
Because it's partly the shock. But the shock is not the shock. The shock is that it happens all the time. Mm-hmm. And that there are people that live a life like that where it's totally normal. And I have a standard operating procedure, right? That when this happens, I'm on a WhatsApp group or a Facebook Messenger group with friends talking about, when their grandma or auntie gets harassed. Hey, what kind of pepper spray should we get? And everybody, it's like a 50-person chain saying, oh, I use this pepper spray. The handle's not as good, but the spray radius is much better. What do you think about this one? Oh, I don't know, actually. I kind of like the weight on this one. You should look at this. Or, hey, actually, this one has a siren that you can attach to it. What do you think? Well, I like that, but actually I like the one where you can attach a knife to it. That's actually way better. Oh, yeah, that makes a ton of sense. What's the chain radius? Oh, good question. Everybody here is completely fluent on the specs for pepper spray and weapons. Mm-hmm. I mean, I want you to think about that. Like, these are 50 people from like completely different lives. And they're like, oh yeah, this happened to all of us. Like, this is what I'd recommend. Just think about that. When you walk anywhere, you're probably not thinking I should bring some pepper spray. This is the point that we sort of talk about. It's like, what you talked about with Carnegie. Like, yeah, you should understand where someone is in their moccasins too, but also understanding that you are in a position where you can make a difference, that you can stand up for other people, even if it's hard. Actually, it's always hard, because the harder it is, probably the more meaningful it is. And doing hard things sucks. I think that's just the honest truth. There's way more we could be doing in that space. There are groups of people that want to pretend it doesn't happen. There are people I talk to who just say, oh, it's just bad luck, and it's hard. It's hard to hear that, because these are people you respect, or peers of yours, or friends, or, people you invested time and energy in, and they're willing to completely disregard your, number one, your feelings, which is always sad, but number two, completely disregard your value in the world. That's probably worse, right? Implicitly, they don't mean to, but that's what it implies, right? That your experience is it's just an inconvenience. The cost of doing business to live here, to exist here, to be something here.
I like I like what you've been saying here. I'm sometimes lost for words, because it's just, again, like you said, I don't have to worry about that at times. It's just like, I just go about my life, and I like to think that I would stand up, but I think a lot of people, when it really comes, it's hard to put yourself in a position where, because there's 11 other bystanders, right, looking at you if you do stand up, and you're like, well, what are they thinking about me? What should I have gotten involved? Should I And all of a sudden, again, like you said, I like that you mentioned that, hey, if it's harder to do, then maybe it's more meaningful, more valuable to society if you do stand up. So thank you for sharing that. And I want to kind of touch on this. This is kind of came to my mind. You said you use jokes to diffuse the situation. So I want to ask you this. What would you say is the best way to diffuse? Like, what would be some of your strategies for people, regardless of race? What would be the best strategies to help diffuse situations like that?
Yeah, I think of three things, right? The first is distract. You distract the person. You're like, hey, look, there's a shiny thing over here. Might actually help diffuse the situation. Two, you try to diffuse it with humor. You try to tell a joke, or you try to reduce the tension. Mm-hmm. You have to sort of assess what other situations, what kind of numbers do you have? How hostile is the person? Does the person have a weapon? Is this a public space? Is there authorities nearby, right? Can someone make a quick phone call? You have to sort of weigh it in the moment. You could also have the person run, right? There's things you can do, but everyone's different in their approach. I would say, my three tend to be effective: distract, deflect, and then, utilize resources near you, or make a stand. But again, if you're making a stand, it could be a violent outcome, and that's probably not a good situation. Obviously, you don't want anyone to get hurt, including the ignorant person. I'll give you an example. I mean, this happened to me maybe 4 or 5 months ago. I was walking back from a meeting, and 2 drunk guys went up to me and asked me if they could rub my belly for good luck because I was like Buddha. And I was like, well, I gotta tell you guys, like, it's not like a genie. I don't like make wishes here. And they had a good laugh. But here's the thing: when that was happening, 2 police officers were right there, and they didn't think anything of it. And after they left, I was like, hey guys, like, what are you doing? Like, you should be stepping in here, because like that's totally not cool. And they're drunk. And like, imagine if I don't say that, they probably want to pick a fight. And then what are you gonna do then? So like, that's a situation where you need to rely on sort of the community component and the authority component too, to be able to say, hey, listen, like, you, just because you have a badge or just because you have some sort of authority doesn't mean you get just to hang out, right? Like, you still have to play a key role there too, which is awkward. It was a really awkward conversation for me to tell these police officers, like, it was super not cool. Like, they need to be in my corner. They shouldn't be a bystander either, right? Like, imagine how hard that is. Like, you're my taxpayers go to that. Taxpayer money goes to that. And then they're just chilling. Like, no. And again, imagine if I wasn't a dude. Imagine if I was a woman, right? Like, that situation's way worse, way worse. And I just, again, it's just as a reminder, then we're having a conversation about weapons. And that's not so good.
Yeah, I see what you're saying there. I like the strategies that you propose there. I think, again, a lot of people can use that, but we should try to avoid having those situations even to begin with. So I think you touched on that perfectly. And I hate to wrap up this episode. I think we're looking at time here, but I like to end with the quote unquote intelligent question of the day. So sure. I want to hear what your answer is to this. And that is, so give me a second. I don't have notes, script, or anything like that. So I try to think of a meaningful question for you to answer. So the intelligent question of the day, I would have to say, is how would you help build a community so then we're not having those situations that we've been talking about today? What would be the best way we could build a community that way?
Well, I mean, minus all the things we just talked about, one thing that I tell all leaders particularly is better mentorship and sponsorship of young people. That's probably the single most powerful thing you can do, especially to mentor or sponsor a young person who, they're first generation American. They're the first in their family. They've probably had significant barriers to government service or access. The opportunities that someone like can give advice to, like just life experience to, I mean, that's probably the single most important thing you can do in terms of developing leaders, right? And what we need in our communities is we need leaders, and we need people willing to do hard things. So that's probably the single most important thing I can think of. I mean, yes, the history, yes, like sharing experiences, yes, training people, yes, providing community money and support. Yes, all those things. But the mentorship part is everything.
Yeah, I want to, that everyone that's listening right now, that is the intelligent answer of the day right there. But I would like to kind of end this with a quote, and then we'll ask for like information you can promote stuff. But a quote that's been stuck with me, and I own 2 small businesses and work in that field, and something that they tell us all the time is for to be a good boss is leaders don't make workers, leaders don't make good people, leaders make more leaders. And I think that touches right on with what you said there. And I think that was a phenomenal answer. So thank you for sharing that. But Jeff, I've been really, this was a great discussion. Like I said at the beginning, and you said as well, this is how you solve issues, bring up problems and, work through it. But I know that you said you were involved in multiple organizations. I don't know if people want to try and do business with you or mentorship programs, whatever it might be. What would be the best way they can reach out to you if they want to get a hold of you, or, if you have a business, anything like that?
Yeah, I think the best way, just on Twitter at Jeffrey D. Lee, we can put it in the notes, but that's probably the best way to follow or find time to talk. And I appreciate the opportunity to speak to you and, chat with the audience today. I'm looking forward to keeping in touch.
Yeah, sweet. So Jeff, thank you for coming on. I loved what you had to share with us today. I think a lot of people can benefit from it, my audience included, and I think we all can learn something from it as well. So just Jeff, thank you for coming on.
Hey, thanks for having me, Josh. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you. So everybody, that is Jeff Lee. As you can tell, he's a very intelligent person, has great things to say. And I would take a lot of his things and, make changes to your lives, be that person that stands up. And Jeff has great things to say. And guys, I would challenge you guys to just, listen to a couple things he say and learn something from him. But stay tuned until next week. We have a great guest lined up for that week as well. See you guys next week. And let's get after it. Hey everyone, if you liked this episode and would like to hear more, be sure to hit that subscribe or follow button. We release a new episode every Wednesday for you guys to listen to. Thank you guys so much for the support that you give. We could not have done this without you guys. If you would like to be a potential guest on the show, check out intelligentconvos.com, and there should be a form there for you guys to fill out. Thank you guys again, and let's get after it.